Time for Money, Power, Politics. President Trump is facing big new scrutiny this morning over his finances. The New York State Department of Taxation and Finance says it is now, quote, vigorously pursuing all appropriate avenues of investigation. Following big allegations, the president used legally dubious tax schemes back in the 90s to increase the fortune left to him by his parents. The details are outlined in a new in-depth report by the New York Times based on 100,000 pages of financial documents, including confidential tax returns from Trump's father and his companies. It is important to note NBC News has not confirmed the allegations in this report. The Times says, quote, much of the money came to Trump because he helped his parents dodge taxes in the 90s. He and his siblings set up a sham corporation to disguise millions of dollars in gifts from their mom and dad. Records and interviews show. Records indicate that Trump helped his father take improper tax deductions worth millions more. Quote, he also helped formulate a strategy to undervalue his parents' real estate holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars, reducing the tax bill when those properties were transferred to him and his siblings. In all, the president's parents transferred more than $1 billion to their children, according to the New York Times. That should have produced a tax bill of at least $550 million, based on a 55% tax on gifts and inheritance at the time. Instead, the kids paid $52.2 million. That's about 5%. An attorney for the president released the following statement, quote, the New York Times allegations of fraud and tax evasions are 100% false and highly defamatory. There was no fraud or tax evasion by anyone. The facts upon which the Times bases its false allegations are extremely inaccurate. All estate matters were handled by licensed attorneys, licensed CPAs, and licensed real estate appraisers who followed all laws and rules strictly. The president's brother, Robert Trump, said, quote, all appropriate gift and estate tax returns were filed and the required taxes were paid. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders also disputed the article and called the report a, quote, misleading attack against the Trump family. Joining me now, MSNBC contributor and executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, Tim O'Brien, along with Mark Thompson and Bret Stephens. I'm just going to point out this. If Donald Trump, which he was, gifted a massive New York City real estate portfolio, all he needed to do was sit on it, and he would be worth a cool $10 billion at least today. Instead, we're mired in this. Walk us through. You are actually name-checked in this article. What's your reaction?
He doesn't sit on anything, so he certainly wasn't going to sit on a pile of money that his dad gave him. So it's a useful notion to say if he had just been a patient, methodical person and a smart investor, he would now have billions of dollars that he doesn't have.
Didn't have to be smart investor, be a chicken, just sit on it.
That's right, put it in an index fund. But that's not who he is. And I think one of the other larger truths in the piece is that he wouldn't be who he is but for his father's support and his father's money. The notion that Donald Trump invented himself out of dust into a prominent Manhattan real estate developer who did it all on his own doesn't really hold water. He was a great marketer and he was a great self-promoter. But from the moment he entered the Manhattan real estate market until his companies went bankrupt, his father was at his side always with massive loans.
Then this New York Times piece, what is it, 13,000 words. Does it square with your reporting over the years?
Yeah, at one point, I had reporting that when Donald was about to go personally bankrupt in the early 1990s, he asked his siblings for $30 million in loans, which he denied. He said, that never happened. I give you my word. But my reporting was really clean. I went with it. He actually sued me in part because of that reporting. And during the litigation, we had the documents that we presented with him that showed, yes, indeed, he had borrowed money from his siblings. The number I had was about $30 million. The Times says it's around 60. There's no doubt he borrowed a lot of money from his father to keep himself afloat. And not just as opportunistically, he would be out of business but for Fred Trump. Donald Trump had a near-death experience with debt in the early 90s, not a corporate bankruptcy only, but a personal bankruptcy. And had Fred's money not been there, the Donald Trump story would have stopped in about 1992.
Well, let's share what Donald Trump, then candidate, back in 2015 said.
My father gave me a small loan of $1 million.
Yeah, so that's just absolutely...
A small loan of $1 million. Brett, what do you think this does to Donald Trump's narrative? Because, again, 35% of the population think this guy's a business god.
You know, for the longest time, whenever I've encountered Trump supporters, one of the lines I keep hearing is, yeah, but he's a very successful businessman, and that's the kind of CEO that we need in America today.
He's a very successful branding and marketing guy, and that's how he won.
Well, I'm not quite sure about that either. Look, this article tells us, I'm not quite sure, and we're going to have to look very carefully about where the line between tax evasion starts and tax avoidance ends. And I think that's really something for investigators to pick up with this piece. But what this piece tells us and sort of fleshes out in this extraordinary detail is that Donald Trump is a classic American grifter, leaving one failure behind time and again, and managing to persuade the next group of suckers that he's a credible and successful businessman. We all kind of knew that, but I don't think we've ever seen it spelled out in quite this extraordinary detail.
We all didn't know that. We all in New York knew that.
Four around the table.
But across the country, people didn't. People fell in love with Donald Trump when they watched him on The Apprentice as that big, bad New York City business guy.
Prior to The Apprentice, he was the punchline for jokes about the excesses of the 1980s. And The Apprentice repositioned him as this entrepreneurial guru. And it was all, as Bret was saying, it was a complete hall of mirrors. This guy has been running the longest con in U.S. history. He is the most successful con man in U.S. history.
Which is why, Bret, I say he's a branding and marketing genius. Mark, they write about Trump's Castle Casino and say, where an $18.4 million bond payment was due in December of 1990, Fred Trump dispatched a trusted bookkeeper to Atlantic City with checks to buy $3.5 million in casino chips without placing a bet. With this ruse, an illegal loan under New Jersey gaming laws resulted in a $65,000 civil penalty. Donald Trump narrowly avoids defaulting on his bonds. How are we supposed to interpret all this? Because, again, Donald Trump just goes to a rally and says, lock her up. Those are three words, three winning words that resonates with America. And what we're saying is, why don't you interpret Donald Trump narrowly not defaulting on bonds?
He's the greatest show on earth. And unfortunately, those who follow him have got to be educated as to how he's making a fool out of them, his consumers, those who buy that. Now, I think some people hear this story this morning and say, wait a minute, something isn't right here. Because he's getting away with everything, and the rest of us, many of us who support him, those who are his supporters, they're saying to themselves, many of us support him, but we're not getting anything out of this deal. He gets whatever he wants. He avoids any and all scrutiny on this. What's interesting, though, if he had not become president, we may not even be having this conversation. You know, and
if he had not become president, Paul Manafort wouldn't be in jail.
Everybody would still be living in luxury. Right.
We stopped prosecuting these kind of things years ago. And even tax experts who are cited in this report say that the president is not likely to face criminal prosecution. And Trump could say, you know what? I'm a loophole guy. I figured it out. It shows how clever I am. Don't you want a clever president?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the vehicles he used, a lot of affluent people used. GRATs or GRATs are not an uncommon way that people try to protect inheritances or gifts to their kids. That there's nothing illegal about those. And that was clearly one of the main things they used. A lot of the other stuff where they were, I think, at best dubious and possibly illegal, where they were lowballing the valuation on buildings and lying about the value of different holdings that they were transferring around, those are really old. It's going to be very hard for any tax investigator, including New York State investigators, to make a legal case out of that. I don't think there'll be any criminal charges. There might be a civil penalty. He knows he's getting away with that.
And he would have continued to if he were not so egomaniacal as to have the need to be president of the United States.
But this is a great contribution to the historical indictment of Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah, no question about it.
It's a great point.
Flim, flam.
It is.